At the furthest edge of the known world lay an island shrouded in mist and legend. A place of wild tribes, savage shores, and a mystical priesthood that held sway over its people. This was Britannia. And for the Roman Empire, an unstoppable force that had conquered continents, this island wasn't just another piece of land to add to the map. It was a challenge to the very idea of Roman dominance, a defiant bastion of rebellion on the fringe of civilization. Even the great Julius Caesar, a man who knew no equal on the battlefield, had tried and failed to bring it to heel. His legions were battered not just by warriors, but by the island's ferocious weather and treacherous seas. He left with little more than stories of a fearsome land, leaving its conquest as an unfinished, tantalizing prize. For nearly a century, Rome just watched from across the narrow sea. But the island's defiance couldn't be tolerated forever. The whispers from its dark groves, the power of its Druids priests, and the constant threat of rebellion were a cancer on the empire's edge. A final reckoning had come. This is the story of how Rome unleashed its fury to tame a land of Druids and rebels. It's a tale of legendary generals, brutal campaigns, and the fiery people who would rather die than be enslaved. The Roman conquest of Britain. This is the story of the Roman conquest of Britain, the ghost of Caesar and the ambition of an emperor. To understand why Rome was so ferocious in AD 43, we have to rewind the clock about 100 years to the first Roman who dared to cross the ocean, Gaius Julius Caesar. Back in 55 and 54 BC, while he was busy with his epic conquest of Gaul, Caesar looked across the channel and saw a threat. You see, British tribes kept helping his Gallic enemies, giving them a safe place to hide and sending reinforcements. They were a constant thorn in Caesar's side. And for a man with boundless ambition, Britain also offered a shot at unparalleled glory, to be the first Roman general to lead an army into this mythical land. But Britain wasn't going down that easy. His first trip in 55 BC was a near disaster. Storms ravaged his fleet, his cavalry never showed up, and his legions were pinned down on the beaches of Kent by unnerving Celtic warriors charging right into the surf. He was gone in less than 3 weeks, with very little to show for it. The second attempt in 54 BC was better planned. With a bigger force and better ships, Caesar pushed inland and even managed to cross the River Thames, defeating a coalition of tribes led by the chieftain Cassivellaunus. Still, he didn't stay. Gaul was still a mess, and the logistics of occupying Britain were a nightmare. Caesar left, his expeditions a mixed bag of military success and strategic failure. He had literally put Britain on the map, turning it from a mythical land into a very real target for Rome. But he'd also shown that it was a place where even Roman legions could be humbled. For the next century, a tense, complicated relationship simmered. Trade flourished, and some southern British kings, like Verica of the Atrebates, became Roman allies. But other, more powerful tribes, like the Catuvellauni, remained fiercely independent. Then, in the early 40s AD, the whole situation exploded. The expansionist Catuvellauni, led by the brothers Caratacus and Togodumnus, kicked the pro-Roman King Verica off his throne. Verica fled to Rome, begging the new emperor Claudius for help. In doing so, he handed Claudius the perfect excuse for a war. Claudius desperately needed a win. He was the last person anyone expected to rule, sidelined by his own family for a limp and a stutter. Proclaimed emperor by the Praetorian Guard after Caligula's assassination, his grip on power was shaky, lacking the military credibility an emperor needed. Claudius needed to erase that embarrassment. He needed a glorious, decisive conquest. This was a full-scale invasion, designed to crush all resistance and finally turn this island of rebels into the province of Britannia. The invasion machine, Aulus, Plautius and the legions. In the spring of AD 43, the might of Rome gathered on the shores of Gaul. That's 20,000 elite heavy infantrymen. And they didn't come alone. They were backed by an equal number of auxiliaries, specialist troops from across the empire. There were Batavian and Thracian infantry, expert swimmers and ferocious fighters, and Gallic cavalry, tow scout, and chase down a broken enemy. All told, Plautius had an army of around 40,000 soldiers and a fleet of nearly 1,000 ships to carry them. This was a machine built for one thing: conquest. But this incredible machine almost stalled before it even started. The legionaries themselves, standing on the shores of Gaul, mutinied. They weren't afraid of a fight, but the idea of crossing the great ocean to a land beyond the known world filled them with a primal dread. It took a sharp-tongued freedman, the emperor's own secretary Narcissus, to get them moving. He basically shamed them into it, and after some mockery, the soldiers fell in line. The mutiny was over. The invasion was on. The fleet finally crossed the channel in 3 massive waves, a true armada descending on the coast of Kent, likely landing at Richborough's large natural harbour. This time, unlike in Caesar's day, no one was there to meet them. The British tribes, led by Caratacus and Togodumnus, had expected the invasion but seemed to have misjudged the landing spot. Instead, they fell back using guerrilla tactics to harass the Roman advance. They knew their land, the dense forests, the hidden marshes. They figured the Romans couldn't cross without building a bridge, which would give them a huge advantage. That was a fatal mistake. They were about to learn that Roman engineering was just as deadly as a Roman sword. The Battle of the Medway, breaking the British line. The River Medway wasn't just a river. It was the first great test of the Roman invasion. On the far bank, a huge coalition of British warriors under Caratacus and Togodumnus waited confidently, protected by the wide tidal river. But Aulus Plautius wasn't about to play by their rules. He had a secret weapon, his Batavian auxiliaries. These men were from the Rhine Delta, and they were famous for being able to swim across raging rivers in full armor. While the main Roman force made a big show of setting up camp to create a diversion, Plautius gave the order. They erupted from the river and crashed into the British horse lines, hamstringing the animals and creating absolute chaos. The Britons' most feared weapon, the war chariot, was neutralized before the main battle even began. The psychological blow was huge. With the British lines in disarray, Plautius launched his main attack. The Second Augusta Legion, led by a young, ambitious general named Vespasian, yes, the future emperor, forded the river, and the Britons were stunned to see them crossing with such discipline. What followed was 2 days of absolute carnage. The first day was a desperate, grinding struggle. The Romans had a foothold, but the Britons, fighting for their homes, resisted with incredible ferocity. The resistance that had held for 2 days finally broke. The Britons fled, hunted down by Roman cavalry. Togodumnus was killed, but his brother Caratacus escaped. The Battle of the Medway was a massive Roman victory, opening the path to the rest of southeastern Britain. Now, whether elephants were actually there is debated by historians, but the story alone shows this was meant as a display of pure shock and awe. Claudius led the final assault on the tribal capital of Camulodunum, modern Colchester. The city fell, and 11 British kings formally surrendered. For Claudius, it was the ultimate triumph. He had succeeded where Caesar had hesitated. He went back to Rome to celebrate, leaving Plautius to begin the long, bloody work of pacification. But one man refused to bend the knee. Caratacus was still out there, and for him, the war was just getting started. The rebel king, the 9-year War of Caratacus. With the southeast seemingly pacified, many in Rome probably thought the conquest was basically over. They were wrong. The fall of Camulodunum wasn't the end of the resistance. It was the beginning of a new, desperate war led by one man, Caratacus. Having escaped the Medway, Caratacus refused to give up. He fled west into the rugged mountains of what is now Wales, a land perfectly suited for the war he now planned to fight. Here, among the proud and warlike Silures and Ordovicus tribes, he found new allies ready to fight the Romans to the death. For the next 9 years, from AD 43 to 51, Caratacus became a ghost, haunting the Roman legions. He'd learned his lesson, no more meeting the Romans in a pitched battle. Instead, he mastered guerrilla warfare. His warriors launched sudden, brutal ambushes from forested hillsides, hitting Roman patrols and supply lines before melting back into the wilderness. He waged a relentless war of attrition that drove a series of Roman governors crazy. The new Roman governor, Publius Ostorius Scapula, became obsessed with capturing him. He pushed his legions deeper into the Welsh mountains, building forts and trying to pin down the elusive British leader. Caratacus was a constant thorn in Rome's side, a symbol of hope for unconquered tribes. The long resistance finally came to a head around AD 51. Caratacus, perhaps pressured by his allies, decided to risk it all on one last stand. He chose his ground carefully, a hilltop fortress protected by steep slopes and a river. Where the ground was less steep, his men built a stone rampart. As the Romans approached, Caratacus gave his men a rousing speech, invoking their ancestors who had driven Caesar himself from their shores. This battle, he declared, was for freedom or eternal slavery. But Scapula was a tough, experienced general, and his men were spoiling for a real fight. After studying the terrain, Scapula found a place to cross the river. His legionaries advanced under a storm of missiles, taking heavy casualties. But their discipline held. They formed the legendary testudo, the tortoise, locking their shields overhead and in front, and just marched straight up the hill. They stormed the rampart, and once they got to close quarters, the fight was over. The Romans' superior armor and short, stabbing gladius swords were devastating against the lightly armored Britons. The British line broke. The resistance that had lasted nearly a decade was shattered. Caratacus's wife and daughter were captured. Caratacus himself escaped the battlefield one last time. He fled north, seeking refuge with Queen Cartimandua of the Brigantes. Bad move. The queen was a Roman ally, and she saw her chance. She had him arrested, chained up, and handed him over to the Romans. The great rebel king was taken to Rome to be paraded in Claudius's triumph, destined for execution. But even in chains, Caratacus was still the defiant king. Standing before the emperor, he gave a speech so eloquent and dignified that Claudius was moved. His resistance, he argued, had only made Rome's victory more glorious. The emperor, persuaded by his courage, pardoned him and his family. Caratacus lived out his days in honorable exile. His war was over, but the fire of rebellion in Britain hadn't been put out. It had just moved from the kings to a more mysterious power, the Druids. The sacred slaughter. Rome versus the Druids. With Caratacus captured, Rome tightened its grip. But the Romans knew military victory wasn't enough. To truly tame Britain, they had to break the spirit of its people. And at the heart of that resistance was the shadowy, powerful order of the Druids. The Druids were more than priests. They were the intellectual and spiritual core of Celtic society, judges, teachers, and philosophers who held immense influence. For the Romans, who were usually tolerant of local religions, Druidism was a unique threat. They saw the Druids as fanatics who stirred up rebellion against Rome. Roman writers accused them of barbaric practices, including human sacrifice. Now, these stories might have been exaggerated for propaganda, but they gave the Romans the perfect excuse to wipe them out completely. The last great sanctuary of the Druids was the island of Mona, modern-day Anglesey, a sacred stronghold off the coast of Wales. So in AD 60, the governor, Suetonius Paulinus, a ruthless and effective general, decided it was time to wipe this nerve center off the map. He marched his legions through the Welsh mountains and finally arrived at the Menai Strait. What they saw on the other side was something out of a nightmare. Among the armed warriors stood black-robed women who looked like furies, shrieking and brandishing torches. And at the center of it all were the Druids, hands raised to the sky, calling down curses on the invaders. The sight was so terrifying that even these hardened Roman soldiers froze in fear. Suetonius had built flat-bottomed boats to cross the strait. They hit the beach with a vengeance. The Romans cut down everyone, warriors, women and Druids. They showed no mercy. Afterwards, Suetonius ordered his men to systematically destroy every trace of the Druidic presence. They cut down the sacred groves and smashed the altars. It was a deliberate and brutal act of cultural erasure designed to extinguish the very soul of the resistance. Suetonius thought he had finally broken British rebellion. He was about to get the shock of his life. Because as the sacred groves of Anglesey burned, a new fire was being lit back in the east. A fire of pure vengeance led by a queen who would make Rome tremble. The fury of Boudica, an island in flames. While Suetonius was busy on Anglesey, he had no idea the province behind him was about to explode. The spark for this new, terrifying uprising came from the brutal humiliation of the Iceni tribe and their queen Boudica. Their king, Prasutagus, trying to protect his family, had made the Roman emperor co-heir in his will along with his two daughters. He hoped this would ensure a smooth transition. But when he died, Roman officials saw an opportunity to get rich. Instead of honoring the will, they decided to annex the entire kingdom. When the Iceni nobility protested, the response was swift and barbaric. Queen Boudica was publicly flogged and her young daughters were raped. It was an act of incredible arrogance and cruelty, a deep personal violation that lit a firestorm of rage. Boudica, described as a tall, terrifying figure with a harsh voice and a mass of red hair, would not let it stand. She became the living embodiment of vengeance. The Iceni rose up in furious rebellion, and they weren't alone. Their neighbors, the Trinovantes, had their own grievances. Their capital, Camulodunum, was now a settlement for retired Roman veterans who had stolen their land and treated them like slaves. The ultimate insult was a massive temple built to honor the divine Claudius, a hated symbol of their conquest, paid for with their own money. United by hatred, the tribes flocked to Boudica's banner. Her army swelled into the tens of thousands, and their first target was Camulodunum. The city was unprepared and fell quickly. The defenders were slaughtered, and the city burned to the ground. When a detachment of the 9th Legion tried to intervene, it was ambushed and wiped out. The news sent a shockwave through the province. The official whose greed had started it all fled to Gaul in terror. Suetonius, hearing the news from Anglesey, acted with incredible speed, racing down the Roman road now known as Watling Street toward the next target, Londinium. Londinium, modern-day London, was a wealthy commercial hub. When Suetonius arrived, he faced a horrible choice. The city was undefended and his main army was too far away. To stay and fight meant certain death. He made the cold, hard military decision, sacrifice the city to save the province. He abandoned Londinium to its fate. Boudicca's army fell on the helpless city. It was sacked, burned, and its people were massacred without mercy. From there, the rebel army marched on Verulamium, St. Albans, and destroyed it too. In just a few weeks, Boudicca's rebellion had destroyed the three biggest Roman centers in Britain. An estimated 70,000 to 80,000 Roman citizens and allies had been killed. The province of Britannia was on the verge of total collapse. Suetonius, having finally regrouped with his legions, knew everything now rested on a single, final battle. The Battle of Watling Street, legion against horde. With the heart of Roman Britain in flames, Suetonius gathered his forces. He had the battle-hardened Legio Fortfont, parts of Legio Baint, and some auxiliaries, an army of just 10,000 men. Facing him was Boudicca's colossal army. Now Roman historians claimed it was hundreds of thousands strong, which is probably an exaggeration, but they still vastly outnumbered the Romans. Suetonius knew he couldn't win on open ground. He had to choose the battlefield perfectly, to turn the Britons' greatest strength, their numbers, into their biggest weakness. He found the perfect spot somewhere along Watling Street, a narrow pass with a dense forest protecting his rear and steep slopes on his flanks. The enemy had no choice but to attack him head-on. His legionaries stood in tight, deep ranks. They were a small, disciplined island of steel, waiting for the tidal wave. The Britons arrived, oozing confidence. They were so sure they'd win, they brought their families along to watch. They parked their wagons in a huge crescent behind the army, which, in a fatal mistake, blocked their own escape route. Before the battle, Boudicca rode in her chariot, giving a fiery speech, telling her troops they must win or die. Then, with a single terrifying roar, the British horde charged. Suetonius ordered his men to hold their ground. They stood silent as the wave thundered towards them. They waited until the charge was at the perfect range, then acted. On command, the legions hurled a devastating volley of their heavy javelins, the Pila. Thousands slammed into the front ranks, crippling the charge. A second volley ripped more holes in the attack, killing its momentum. As the charge broke, Suetonius ordered his men forward. The Roman infantry surged into the disordered Britons in tight, wedge-shaped formations. Now the brutal efficiency of the Roman killing machine took over. In the tight space, the Britons' long swords were useless, while the legionaries' short gladius was perfect for stabbing. The Romans pushed forward relentlessly, a wall of shields and blades. As the British centre collapsed, the Roman cavalry charged, smashing into the flanks. The Britons broke and tried to run, but their escape was blocked by their own wagons. The battle turned into a slaughter. The Romans, giving no quarter, massacred not only the warriors but their families as well. Tacitus claims 80,000 Britons died for the loss of only 400 Romans. Again, the numbers are probably skewed, but the result was absolute. Boudicca, her army and her dream of a free Britain both destroyed, reportedly took poison to avoid being captured. With her death, the Great Rebellion was over. The final conquest and the Roman peace. The aftermath of the battle was brutal. Suetonius unleashed a punitive campaign across the rebel lands, burning and destroying. His methods were so harsh, he was eventually recalled to Rome and replaced by a more diplomatic governor. The fire of the southern tribes had been extinguished, but the island was not yet fully tamed. The north was still a wild frontier. The final chapter of the conquest belongs to one of Rome's most celebrated generals, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, who became governor in AD 77. Agricola was the complete package. Not just a brilliant general, but a smart administrator who knew that true conquest wasn't just about winning battles. His son-in-law, the historian Tacitus, wrote a biography of him that gives us a vivid account of his campaigns. Agricola spent 7 years pushing Roman power to its absolute limit. He finished the conquest of Wales, secured northern England, and then marched his legions into the misty highlands of Caledonia, what we now call Scotland. He advanced systematically, building forts and roads, while his fleet sailed up the coast, providing support. Year after year, he pushed deeper, facing fierce resistance. Finally, around AD 83, the Caledonian tribes gathered for one last huge battle at a place Tacitus calls Mons Graupius. Their leader, Calgacus, is given a powerful speech by Tacitus, a bitter condemnation of Roman imperialism. They create a desert, he says of the Romans, and call it peace. Tacitus claims over 30,000 Caledonian warriors faced Agricola's smaller force of about 11,000. Like with most ancient battles, these numbers are probably inflated, but the odds were still stacked against the Romans. The battle followed a familiar pattern. After an exchange of missiles, the disciplined auxiliaries charged. As the battle raged, Agricola unleashed his cavalry, which swept around and attacked from the rear. The Caledonian line collapsed. It was another crushing Roman victory. After Mons Graupius, Agricola had pushed Roman power further than ever before. But was the entire island conquered? Not really. Agricola was recalled to Rome soon after, and the emperor decided that holding the rugged, economically poor highlands just wasn't worth the cost. The legions pulled back, and eventually the northern frontier of the Roman Empire was fixed by the monumental structure of Hadrian's Wall. The age of conquest was over. The age of Roman Britain had begun. For the next 3.5 centuries, Britain was a Roman province. A new hybrid Romano-British culture emerged. The Romans brought roads, cities like Londinium and Iberacum, grand villas with mosaics and heating, aqueducts and public baths. Latin became the language of government. But let's be clear, this was a transformation built on force. The old tribal ways never fully vanished. The conquest had been a story of staggering brutality and deliberate cultural erasure. It gave rise to heroes like Caratacus and Boudica, defiant figures who, centuries later, would become powerful symbols of British identity. Rome had tamed the land of Druids and rebels, but it had done so at a terrible cost, leaving a legacy of both civilization and subjugation that would shape the island's destiny for 1,000 years. The Roman conquest of Britain is one of the most dramatic clashes of civilizations in history. If you found this journey compelling, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell for more explorations of the past. Let us know in the comments which part of this epic story you found most fascinating. Was it the defiance of Caratacus? The fury of Boudica? Or the methodical might of the Roman legions? We'd love to hear from you. For over 350 years, Britain remained part of the Roman world. The island at the edge of the map became an integrated, if sometimes turbulent, piece of the empire. But no empire lasts forever. In the early 5th century, as Rome itself began to crumble, the legions were withdrawn, leaving the Romanized Britons to face new waves of invaders, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. The world Rome had built began to fade, but it never fully disappeared. The roads they built still lie beneath many modern routes. The cities they founded are still major hubs today. And the memory of their conquest, of the epic struggle between an empire and an island, has echoed down through the centuries, a permanent and powerful chapter in the story of Britain.